Boa noite a todos e todas. É um prazer recebê-los hoje para mais um evento do Instituto Brasil-Israel, no Rio de Janeiro. Mais uma oportunidade de estarmos juntos nesse momento em que consideramos fundamental o cultivo de espaços de diálogo. Gostaríamos de agradecer aos nossos parceiros e doadores, aqueles que apoiam diretamente para a realização desse evento, e a vocês que estão aqui hoje. Para aqueles que ainda não estão familiarizados com o IB, permitam-me contextualizar. Nossa missão e nosso compromisso com a democracia e com a defesa da coexistência. Fundado há 7 anos, com o objetivo de estimular o debate qualificado sobre Israel e sobre os judeus no Brasil, o IB busca estabelecer pontes de cooperação e aprendizado mútuo, de produção de conteúdos críticos e promoção de ideias e perspectivas, por vezes discordantes, mas que refletem a pluralidade e a diversidade na qual nos propomos atuar. É nosso objetivo contribuir para aprofundar e dar visibilidade a diferentes análises, sempre de forma respeitosa, influenciando na construção de reflexões não simplistas, não superficiais e não extremistas sobre a realidade e que ajudem na busca de soluções para a garantia dos valores democráticos e humanistas. Hoje, temos a honra de receber um convidado muito especial, Gershon Baskin, figura proeminente nas discussões sobre a paz e segurança no Oriente Médio. Baskin é um ativista pela paz e negociador israelense. É autor de Israel e Palestina, um ativista em busca da paz, publicado no Brasil pela Ayalon, selo judaico da Edra. O livro está disponível para venda na entrada do teatro. Hoje, Israel vive um cenário ainda mais crítico, com mais pessoas sequestradas, com mais de 100 pessoas sequestradas ainda em poder do Hamas. Com esse experiente negociador, vamos entender como enxergar essa situação. Sua experiência e visão nos oferecem uma perspectiva única sobre os desafios e as oportunidades que o diálogo entre Israel e a Palestina nos apresenta. A conversa será conduzida por Leila Sterenberg, jornalista brilhante, já conhecida pelo público do IB em seus programas semanais, o Leila Entrevista e o Notícias de Guerra, junto com Henrique Zimmermann. O encontro de hoje é uma oportunidade para analisarmos o passado, entendermos o presente e, quem sabe, encontrarmos caminho para um futuro mais harmonioso. Esse é o nosso segundo Leila Entrevista presencial e esperamos que muitos outros venham pela frente. Aproveito esse momento para convidá-los a seguir as nossas redes, a usufruir de nossos conteúdos e se aproximarem, trazerem diferentes perspectivas e opiniões para se somarem a este enorme desafio que é apresentar e dialogar junto com a sociedade brasileira sobre a complexidade das temáticas vividas pelos judeus e pelo Estado de Israel. E, por fim, como uma instituição sem fins lucrativos, o IB hoje conta com o apoio de colaboradores através de doações para dar continuidade a esse trabalho. Gostaria de convidá-los a se juntar a nós, apoiando um trabalho que é essencial e que impacta positivamente a comunidade judaica e a extrapola, alcançando e impactando a sociedade civil brasileira. Se você se sentir inspirado a contribuir e quiser fazer parte dessa causa, ficaremos imensamente agradecidos. Cada doação desempenha um papel fundamental para criar um impacto duradouro para o IB. Aproveito o momento para desejar um Shana Tová para todos e que tenhamos muita paz e os nossos sequestrados de volta. Chamo agora ao palco, para essa noite especial, Leila Sterenberg e Gershon Baskin.
Muito obrigada, Adriana, pelas carinhosas palavras. Boa noite, Erev Tov, good evening. Vou fazer uma pequena introdução em português, depois a gente passa para o inglês durante a nossa conversa aqui com o Gershon. Bom, vou apresentar a vocês o Gershon, vocês já sabem. que ele é a pessoa graças a quem Gilad Shalit está vivo. Foi o negociador da soltura de Gilad Shalit, como a gente sabe, mas ele é muito mais que isso. É alguém que vem se empenhando em conversar com o Hamas na tentativa de libertar os reféns em Gaza. A gente estava no camarim e ele estava no telefone com uma pessoa em Jerusalém, que depois ele vai contar para a gente. A negociação não para. É alguém que diz com todas as letras que Benjamin Netanyahu vem sabotando a possibilidade de acordo e que há messiânicos loucos no atual governo israelense, fazendo com que a Cisjordânia, por exemplo, esteja prestes a explodir, sem falar no que acontece nesse momento com o Hezbollah. A gente vai entrar nisso já já. Apesar de tudo isso, ele é um otimista, que continua acreditando na solução de 2 estados. Quando ele foi do conselho consultivo de um movimento juvenil judaico em Long Island, onde ele cresceu, o Gershon ganhou um nome hebraico, Gesher Shalom, que no meu hebraico de principiante é quase Gesher Le Shalom, ponte para a paz. Uma ponte para a paz é algo que todos nós aqui essa noite queremos ver construída. Dito isso, uma salva de palmas para ele.
I'll just smile.
You smile and I was saying nice things about
Thank you.
You can.
I can't see
True, right?
anyone. Can you see them? I can't see them.
Kind of,
Okay.
not really.
Hi.
Is my mic okay? Because I hear some noise, but anyway. So, Gershon, first of all, it's such a pleasure, an honor to be here with you this evening. And thank you so much for being here in Brazil, for your interviews with the Brazilian press, for the talks you had in São Paulo with the Jewish community, and especially for being here with us this evening. We have so much to talk about, and how to start is always tricky, a tough choice. But as a reporter, I would like to begin with the latest developments. The New York Times calls what's happening today the deadliest day of Israeli attacks in Lebanon since at least 2006. Well, we had 11 months of attrition war, then the explosions of pagers and walkie-talkies last week, and anyway, we all know what's going on, and I would like to have your take on that. And I'd like to ask you, what do you foresee as the likely consequences?
First of all, good evening, everyone, and I love your city. It's great to be here. I was here 13 years ago, and nothing's changed. It remains as beautiful as it was 13 years ago. What's going on in Lebanon is part of the tragedy that we've been experiencing since October 7th, and it should be very clear to everyone that there is no military solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and there is no military solution to the conflict between the country of Lebanon and the state of Israel. And everything that we're seeing today is part of the ongoing tragedy that we've lived for too long, with too many innocent people being killed, and our leaders fail to understand that we only empower and strengthen the extremist when we use violence against them. There are political solutions that have to be on the table. The clearest of them is that on the day that the war in Gaza ends, the war of attrition between Lebanon and Hezbollah and Israel will end. The situation of the security of the state of Israel and north of Israel and the south of Lebanon needs to be back on the diplomatic table. There was a UN resolution which was in force. For 17 years, not a single bullet was shot over the Lebanese border to Israel. The force that was created in southern Lebanon is not effective. It was not enforced as it should be. We need to revisit UN Security Council Resolution 1701. There needs to be a more robust force there with a very clear mandate on how to use the weapons that it has to ensure that Hezbollah will not be implanted in southern Lebanon. But let's face it, at the end of the day, in the absence of political solutions, Israel needs to defend its border from the border. October 7th would not have happened if there had been 15 tanks and 3 helicopters in the air, It's not as if Israel was facing the Russian army on that day. The problem was that when Hamas attacked us on October 7th, the Israeli army wasn't there. They were busy in other places, serving as an occupation police force in the West Bank, not protecting Israel's borders. We thought that we could outsmart them by using intelligence, by using electronic surveillance. Hamas was much smarter. They took out Israel's electronic surveillances on the border with drones that you can buy on Amazon and hand grenades, and silenced Israel's defenses on October 7th. That's how simple it was. And it turns out that if you have a border, you have to defend your border with troops if you don't have peace on the other side. But at the end of the day, we have to achieve peace with the other side.
So, if there is no deal for Gaza to bring the hostages home and to cease the war, to stop the war, there is no peace between Israel and Hezbollah.
As long as the war goes on in Gaza, the war with Lebanon will continue. Netanyahu's latest spin is that if we destroy Hezbollah, which we can't do, we're going to weaken Sinwar and the Hamas leadership in Gaza. And this is just another spin. This war started with the spin of, if we conquer the city of Gaza, if we conquer the Shifa hospital, if we conquer Khan Yunis, if we conquer the Rafah crossing, if we conquer the city of Rafah, the Philadelphia, every day there's a new spin, rather than recognizing that what needs to happen is this war has to end. There is a deal on the table. As of 3 weeks ago, I received an agreement from Hamas. They gave it to me in writing on September 12th, that they are willing to end the war in 3-week period of time and return all the Israeli hostages, 101 hostages. Netanyahu said yesterday in the Knesset that they believe that only half of them are alive. Every day that they remain in Gaza is a danger to their life. And if, God forbid, Israel finds Sinwar and kills him before the hostages are returned, Hamas will probably kill all the hostages. And a situation where the state of Israel, which has part of its soul, part of its ethos, that we don't leave anyone behind, if it turns out that Netanyahu and his government have sacrificed the hostages on the altar of Netanyahu's political career, it will take generations for Israel to heal from this.
So Netanyahu doesn't want a deal, an agreement. That's very clear. And an Israeli negotiator told you so, according to the interview you gave to the Brazilian press. And he uses what's happening between Israel and Hezbollah to divert international pressure and international attention, I'd say, and even domestic attention, domestic pressure, in order to reach an agreement.
That's right. What we have to understand is that at this point in the war, we're in day 353, I think, we're approaching 1 year of this war, unbelievable, that it seems that the only way to reach an agreement now between Israel and Hamas is if President Biden decides that his legacy should not be the Gaza war, but ending the Gaza war. He has 2 more months before elections. If Biden does not impose an agreement on Netanyahu, Biden is going to go down in history as the man who fueled the war in Gaza and responsible for it not ending. This is an opportunity. Now, I communicated with the White House today. They have questions that they want answered from Hamas about the day after. If they do impose an agreement on Netanyahu, what happens in Gaza on the day after? And here, once again, we go back to Netanyahu, because he has refused politically to deal with the day after. But Hamas says, this is a communication I received this evening, and I'll get it authorized by a senior Palestinian figure who's not from Hamas tomorrow, from Hamas, that they're willing to see the establishment of a nonpartisan, professional, technocratic government, which they are not part of. The follow-up question that I asked and didn't get an answer from yet, because it's 2 o'clock in the morning in Doha, is what about the internal security and their arms? Are they willing to turn them over to a new Palestinian professional technocratic government? We're talking about a government that would function in Gaza for 2 to 3 years before there's stabilization and before Palestinians can have elections. What Hamas realizes with more than 2 million people homeless in Gaza now, with everything destroyed. There's no infrastructure, there's no sanitation, there's no fresh water, there's no food, there are no schools. The universities were destroyed by Israel. The roads were destroyed, everything. Gaza is destroyed. But if Hamas is in control of Gaza, not $1 of international money from the Arab states, from the Arab Gulf, or from Europe, or the United States will enter Gaza. The future of more than 2 million people in Gaza now depends on Hamas accepting that they will no longer govern Gaza. And this is the best thing that we have going for us, because there is no future for Gaza with Hamas in charge. And the Americans probably won't use the pressure they have on Netanyahu to reach an agreement to end this war without the knowledge that there will be some reasonable, legitimate replacement of Hamas in Gaza.
Does the likelihood of such pressure coming from the U.S. diminish or increase as we approach the presidential elections?
I don't think it has any impact. He won't lose Jewish votes, or not many. The states where the Jews live in America are New York, California, Florida, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a Jewish governor and a Jewish senator, and they're very popular. He may lose some votes on the margins, but not much. 3 out of 4 American Jews vote for Biden, vote for the Democrats. 3 out of 4 American Israelis vote for Trump. That's the difference between American Israelis and American Jews. Kamala Harris might lose some of the Jewish money if there's pressure, but her campaign is weighted down by this war in Gaza. If she does win the elections, God willing, she does not want this on her agenda when she enters the White House. This war needs to be beyond her. She has much bigger issues, domestic issues to deal with. And again, this is Biden's legacy. He was a great president for the United States. I'm not sure he was so great for foreign policy, but for domestic American politics, he was a great president. But his legacy, he will be remembered as the man who supported the war in Gaza if he doesn't bring it to an end.
As for the technocratic government you mentioned for Gaza, without Hamas, who would be leading such government? Members of the Palestinian Authority, and would Arab states support?
No, first of all, as one of the Palestinian leaders that I'm in contact with says, the government in Gaza, the government in Palestine needs to be without Hamas and without Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas is 89 years old. He's in the 19th year of a 4-year term. The only thing that almost every Palestinian agrees on is that he has to go. They need new elections. They want new leaders. There were supposed to be elections in May of 2021, and Mahmoud Abbas canceled those elections. But there's no legitimate legal framework to appoint a governor for Gaza other than Abbas. So Abbas needs to appoint someone, and then the government that's established in Gaza needs to be disconnected from Ramallah until the Palestinians can hold elections and have a unified government that is elected. There are a handful of people, maybe 3, maybe 4 people in Palestine who are legitimate, who are not corrupt, who are independent, who support peace with Israel in a 2-state solution, are against violence, and do not support Hamas. The leading figure that I can think of is someone named Nasser al-Kidwa. Maybe that name is not known. Nasser al-Kidwa was the PLO representative in the United Nations for 17 years. He was foreign minister in one of the Palestinian Authority governments. He's the nephew of Yasser Arafat, which sort of makes him part of the royal family of Palestine. In May of 2021, when there were supposed to be elections, he headed a political party, one of 36 political parties that registered in those elections that Abbas canceled. He headed a political party that was supported by Marwan Barghouti from prison. Marwan Barghouti is the most popular Palestinian figure. He's in prison for 22 years, serving 5 life sentences plus 40 years. But Nasser al-Kidwa had Marwan's support. Now, Nasser is living in exile because Abbas threw him out of Fatah. He was a member of the Central Committee of Fatah, and he was also president of the Yasser Arafat Foundation. This man has credibility. And not only that, in the last few months, I brought him and former Prime Minister Olmert together to negotiate a proposal for moving forward toward a 2-state solution. And Nasser and Olmert signed this document together, and now we're distributing it around the world, meeting with foreign ministers and showing that there's light at the end of the tunnel. There's a beacon of hope that we have to latch onto, because we need that. We need to make the 2-state solution real if we want to fight the extremists in Israel and the extremists in Palestine. It's only by making the vision of a real freedom and liberation and dignity possible for Israelis and Palestinians. That's the only way that Israelis and Palestinians will have security, is if we all have freedom, liberation, and dignity, independence, and mutual respect. So there's a road forward, but it's going to take, Mahmoud Abbas became Prime Minister of Palestine when George W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice forced on Arafat Mahmoud Abbas as a Prime Minister. He hasn't gotten up from the seat since then. But the Palestinian law actually created the position of Prime Minister to take power away from the president when Arafat was president. Abbas became president and reassumed all the power of the presidency and basically controls a dictatorship. Now the Arab leaders, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, together with the Americans and the Saudis, need to impose on Abbas his own retirement and the appointment of Nasser al-Kidwar or someone like him.
Or Marwan Barghouti, perhaps?
Marwan is likely to be freed in the deal with Hamas. Marwan is kind of a black box because Marwan, in the 22 years that he's been in prison, hasn't spoken. He doesn't speak politically. I've been in contact with him all the years through his lawyers. I arranged a correspondence between him, a written correspondence between him and a former head of the Israeli Shin Bet, and that was going on for about a year and a half before October 7th. It ended in October 7th. Marwan, like all the other seniors Palestinian prisoners, are in solitary confinement. He's been moved 5 times since the beginning of the war. He's not allowed any family visits. His lawyer has seen him 3 times since October 7th. He's been tortured in prison by Ben Gvir's prison guards. So he's not in good shape. I believe in the last letter that Marwan Barghouti wrote to this former head of the Shin Bet, he voiced his strong support for the 2-state solution. But Marwan also said that if we have no partner in Israel, we reserve the right for the armed struggle. And I think this is a big mistake. I published an article in a Palestinian daily newspaper calling on Marwan to take back that statement and say that the Palestinians, particularly after October 7th, the Palestinians no longer have an option of an armed struggle. In fact, they have to pass in their election law when they go to elections that any political party that supports the armed struggle should not be allowed to run. The state of Palestine, which is being recognized now, I think, by 152 countries, cannot have a militia. It can only have 1 gun and 1 sovereign. And that there cannot be separate militia who have the right to take weapons in their arms and use an armed struggle against Israel. That will not work for the Palestinians anymore. They need to do it for themselves, not for Israel. They will not be a member of the international community, the community of nations, unless they observe the rules of law of the international community, which, by the way, in this war, we have crossed. All of us. Hamas and Israel have crossed moral red lines in this war that should never be crossed.
And the problem is the current Israeli government doesn't support a 2-state solution. So we need a new government.
That's for sure.
And the current government has to collapse. So what does it take for this government to collapse? Like 1 million people on the streets?
We have a challenged democracy at best. We've been moving steadily in the direction of Hungary, of what Poland was before it started to turn back, what was happening in this country, of our democracy shrinking. Our legislative branch of government is almost irrelevant today. It's completely controlled by the executive. And since Netanyahu came back to power 2 years ago, they started the judicial upheaval to remove the independence of the judiciary, which hasn't stopped. It's continuing. When I contacted one of the chief negotiators 3 weeks ago with the agreement of Hamas for a deal to end the war in 3 weeks, his response back to me, we were communicating on WhatsApp, his response back to me was that Netanyahu doesn't want to end the war. And I wrote back to him saying, when are you going to stop being afraid of Netanyahu? He wrote back to me saying, we're not afraid of Netanyahu, but he's the decision maker. I wrote back to him, I said, to the best of my knowledge, Israel is not yet a dictatorship, and there's more than one decision maker. There's the cabinet, there's the government, there's the Knesset, and the people of Israel are the sovereign. And then I added, and your job as negotiators is not to be yes men to Netanyahu, but to put options before the government. And if the government rejects them, present them to the people. Now, we have a very difficult time removing Netanyahu from power. He has a coalition of 64 seats out of 120. We need 5 righteous men to stand up, and they're men, not women, unfortunately. 5 righteous men to stand up and vote against the government, but they know they'll be voting themselves out of the power. The chances that they will return are very small.
Who would be the 5 righteous men?
The most likely scenario that we have in front of us today is that maybe some of the ultra-Orthodox parties would bolt the government on 2 issues. One is on the issue of the draft law, because the reality in Israel is that we cannot allow tens of thousands of ultra-Orthodox Jews every year not to serve in the army. The army needs them. If we're not going to rely solely on technology and we need people on the border, we need soldiers. We already have too many soldiers who have killed in this war already. Thousands of soldiers who have been wounded in this war already. Reservists are serving more than 200 days since the beginning of the war in the army. We can't do that. The ultra-Orthodox need to be drafted into the army like everyone else. That could break up the government because the Supreme Court ordered the government to begin drafting these people. There's no effective law.
Please try again.
Sorry. There's no effective law in Israel today which allows the government not to draft them anymore. The other issue is also an ultra-Orthodox issue, and this is the provocations of Itamar Ben-Gvir, our so-called Minister of National Security, who goes up to the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque, to pray, breaking the historic status quo that Jews pray at the Kotel at the Western Wall, and Muslims pray on the Temple Mount in Al-Aqsa. And this provocation is leading to a big fight with the ultra-Orthodox because according to halakha, according to Jewish religious law, the standard Jewish law that the ultra-Orthodox observe, and the chief rabbinate of Israel, Jews should not go up there in order not to desecrate it because of a religious, I don't want to go into the details, but there are religious reasons why they believe that Jews shouldn't go there until the Messiah comes. And this could break up the government as well. I don't know if it will. I believe that once it becomes clear to the people of Israel that there's a real deal on the table that will return the 101 Israeli hostages, I think we'll see more than 1 million Israelis on the street. 3 weeks ago, we had 700,000 Israelis out on the street. Someone told me that's equivalent to 18 million Brazilians. Think of the size of these demonstrations. We need 1 million, 2 million Israelis on the street calling to bring down the government. And the demonstrations to bring back the hostages today are not just about the hostages, they're calling for new elections. 2 weeks ago, when I was I've been traveling, so the last demonstration I was at, I live in Jerusalem, so I go to the demonstrations in Jerusalem. It was the first time since the beginning of the war that these demonstrations, I noticed rage, anger from the people demonstrating. And we need that anger, we need that rage from the public in order to make a difference.
But the thing is, if Netanyahu accepts an agreement, most probably the government will collapse.
Hopefully.
Yeah. But
we win. It's a win,
exactly.
win, 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 win.
But the thing is, then he will have to face a trial. I mean, he's in trouble.
He's in trial
Yeah,
now. His trial is going on for years.
Okay, so he'll be in trouble, and he will lose his immunity, something he's been avoiding for years now. And he doesn't want it, so...
No, of course. Netanyahu's put the hostages on the altar of his political career. Netanyahu, before this, is a narcissistic man. He's like Trump, only more intelligent. You have to understand, Netanyahu, before the war, he presented himself as the greatest leader of the Jewish people since Moses. That's what he said about himself. He's the man who saves Israel, prevents the next Holocaust. When this man is solely responsible for bringing Iran closer to a nuclear breakout than anyone else before him. The man who was Mr. Iran, who convinced the Americans to withdraw from the nuclear treaty, which would have prevented Iran from having more enriched uranium. Netanyahu will go down in history, without a doubt, as the worst leader of the Jewish history in all the chronicles of Jewish history. The worst leader we have ever had, and he deserves that. There's no escaping that. Netanyahu is trying now to avoid the creation of a national commission of inquiry headed by a Supreme Court judge that has power to subpoena and power to punish, and Netanyahu doesn't want it. But he's facing now warrants by the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and he thinks that by creating some kind of phony commission of inquiry by the government that has no power He can avoid The Hague. He's not going to. But I'll tell you a secret. It's not a secret. That the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, has said in discussions with the families of the hostages that if Netanyahu agrees to a deal that ends the war, he would consider withdrawing his demand for warrants for the arrest of Netanyahu and Gallant.
Yeah, that's leverage.
This is real leverage.
Yeah, sure. And as for the moment we're going through, the United Nations General Assembly has just started. It's just beginning. Does it make any difference? I mean, because most probably many of the speeches will address the situation in the Middle East.
You know, in Hebrew, the UN is called which stands for Umot Muchadot, United Nations. And it was Ben Gurion who coined the phrase Shmum. This is how Israel relates to the United Nations. How many resolutions have been passed in the United Nations against Israel, and how many has Israel observed? If the United Nations doesn't have the force of the power of Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, which empowers the United Nations to use sanctions or send troops, then it's just empty words on a piece of paper in terms of Israel. And for those of you who don't know, every year this ceremony when Netanyahu goes to the United Nations, what we see on the television screens in Israel, I don't know what you see here, what we see is Netanyahu in front of the green wall. What they don't show us is the empty General Assembly. When Netanyahu speaks, everyone leaves except the crowd that Netanyahu brings along with him to applaud every time he speaks. If it was the US Congress, they'd be standing up and sitting down. But in the UN, they just clap.
Well, you said in interviews that Bibi is a hostage of the hard right members of his cabinet. But is he a hostage if he chose to be in this situation, if he appointed and continues to empower Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich?
Right, before the elections, when Netanyahu was interviewed on Israeli television, and he was asked, would you make Itamar Ben-Gvir a minister in your government? He said, no chance, no way, no. And of course he did. He has legitimized the extreme right in Israel in a way that never happened before. They were never legitimized. In fact, Itamar Ben-Gvir was prevented from running in the elections for many years. He's a follower of Rabbi Meir Kahana, whose party was outlawed. The party that Ben-Gvir grew up in, Kach Party, is considered a terrorist organization in Israel. And Itamar Ben-Gvir has been indicted 8 times, I think, for acts of terrorism. And he's in charge of the police today. And the Israeli police today are Ben-Gvir. The Israeli police, I don't know if you saw today in the news in Israel, but there was a demonstration of ultra-Orthodox today, and the police went in with massive violence against them. We have a police which is being converted into Ben-Gvir's police. They control the prison authority now. This is having deep impact that's going to take a long time to change when Itamar Ben-Gvir is no longer in government.
Interestingly, Bibi was also prime minister when Gilad Shalit was freed after almost 6 years in a Hamas prison. On that occasion, unlike now, he made it clear he wanted all efforts to be made to bring Shalit home, right?
Yeah, let's not forget Gilad Shalit was in captivity for 5 years and 4 months.
Sure.
The deal to release him was on the table 6 months after he was abducted. He was abducted in June of 2006. By December 2006, there was a deal on the table to release 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for his life. The deal was even specified that the first list of 450 would be chosen by Hamas. The second 550 would be chosen by Israel. 5 years later, that was the deal. It took Netanyahu, the backstory is, and this is quite amazing, during Passover in April of 2011, the Shalit family had already been camped out in front of the Prime Minister's house for more than a year, and on Erev Pesach, they held their Seder on the street in front of the Prime Minister's house. Myself and my family went to wish them a happy holiday before we had our own Seder, and it was a very sad picture. The backstory is that Sarah Netanyahu, Netanyahu's wife, looked out the window, saw them sitting on the street. She turned to her husband and said, "Bring him home already." The next day, or 2 days later, on the first day of Chol HaMoed Pesach, Netanyahu called a Mossad officer named David Meidan, a very reputable guy, was in the Mossad for more than 30 years, senior officer. And Meidan sat with Netanyahu and said to Netanyahu, "I'm willing to take the job, but I want to know I have a clear mandate. And Netanyahu said to him 3 words. He said, bring him home. 353 days now with 101 hostages remaining in Gaza, Netanyahu has not said to his negotiators, bring them home. And I don't understand, quite frankly, why these 3 men, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shin Bet, and a retired general, are negotiating for all these months now without a mandate to reach an agreement. Netanyahu made a leadership decision in 2011. It took him a long time. A leadership decision is not the decision that leaders make. A leadership decision is when you put your values on one side of the scale and you put opposing values on the other side of the scale and you rule for the opposing values. That's what Netanyahu did. He was Mr. We don't negotiate with terrorists, we don't release prisoners to terrorists, and then he did it. And not only did he do it, but 26 members of his government voted for it, only 3 opposed. The head of the Mossad, the head of the Shin Bet, the chief of the police, the chief of the staff of the army, all recommended to the government to vote for it. And almost 80% of the Israeli public supported the deal that everyone knew was a bad deal. In the first release of 450 prisoners, more than 300 of them had killed Israelis. 4 of them killed my wife's first cousin. They were released in this deal. Yahya Sinwar was released in the deal. By the way, no one in the security thought that Yahya Sinwar was dangerous because he was serving 4 life sentences for killing Palestinians. He didn't kill Jews, so they didn't take him seriously. By the way, the second group of 550 that were released, none of them had killed Israelis, and they were mostly Fatah people who were released to help empower the Palestinian Authority, something that Netanyahu was never interested in doing.
And as you say very often, it wasn't a good deal, but it was the possible deal.
It was the only deal
yeah.
that could bring Gilad Shalit home. And I think that the state of Israel and the entire world was in awe when Israel made that deal to save 1 soldier. It showed the character of our nation and the character of our soul. And we stood up to our ethos that we don't leave anyone behind, that ethos that has been broken in this war by Netanyahu.
And the whole negotiation was possible thanks to your contact with a Hamas member called Hazi Hamad, whom you met because you had met at a United Nations conference in Cairo.
I didn't meet him. I met a professor.
Okay, you met the professor.
Right.
And this professor put you guys in contact, right?
The professor was someone I met at a United Nations, a World Bank conference,
Okay.
actually. I was the only Israeli there. He came from Gaza because he thought there might be Israelis there. He'd never spoken to a Jew before. I'd been working with Palestinians for more than 20 years at that point, and I was introduced to him by a colleague from Gaza. We spent about 6 hours over the next 2 days talking. I proposed to him that we create an official dialogue between Israelis and Hamas. I found 4 countries that would sponsor us. In the end, it didn't happen because the Hamas leadership vetoed it. But in the process of trying to make it happen, I went to Gaza. I met with him at the Islamic University in Gaza. I met his colleagues. And together we went to the Hamas Prime Minister's office to meet with one of the advisors of the Prime Minister who said that he would join the group and then couldn't. I invited the professor to a conference that I organized in Istanbul of Israelis and Palestinians. And then a week after Gilad Shalit was abducted, the professor called me and said, Gershon, we have to do something. He said, we have no water, we have no electricity, we're being bombed, the situation is really bad and it's going to get worse. I said, what can we do? He said, let's try to open up a channel of communication. He went to the Prime Minister's office. Later that morning, Ghazi Hamid called me. He was the spokesperson of the government, an advisor to the Prime Minister. He spoke to me in Hebrew, which was really weird. I said to him, you can speak to me in English, you can speak to me in Arabic. He said to me, I like to speak Hebrew. He learned Hebrew in prison. And then he proposed to me, let's organize a telephone call between one of the Hamas leaders and the father of the soldier. Now, I'm sitting in my kitchen. I have 2 sons who at that point were pre-army age. I'm looking at my sons, thinking about Gilad Shalit. And here's this Hamas guy who wants to talk to the father of the soldier. I put myself in his place. I was really taken back. Anyway, that was the first phone call between Ghazi Hamid and I. Of well over 1,000 phone calls. We met face-to-face in Gaza twice. We met face-to-face in Cairo. I talked to him this morning from here.
And 17 members of his family were killed after
You know,
October
he
7th?
was the person, he was sent out of Gaza to Beirut before the war. I didn't know that. I was communicating with him on the second night of the war. I heard on the news that the Israelis bombed his house. And I called him and I said to him, Razi, the man responsible for freeing Gilad Shalit from the Hamas side, I said, if they're going after you, no one in Hamas is safe. I didn't know he wasn't in Gaza. He didn't say anything. I started talking to him over the next days about releasing all the women, the children, the elderly, the sick and wounded hostages, who I knew that they had no plans to take as hostages. They didn't have the logistics for dealing with it. I immediately checked how many women prisoners, how many teenage prisoners there were in the Israeli jails. I started communicating with people in the war cabinet to say that there's a deal, this is low-hanging fruit, we can do this quickly. Razi Hamad then made this horrible interview on Lebanese television that I think the whole world saw, where he called Israel an immoral state, a state that has no right to exist, and October 7th should happen again, again, and again. And I wrote him a letter saying, this is not the Razi Hamad I've known for 17 years. What happened to you? If this is what you believe, then you don't deserve to talk to me. It was a very powerful letter. And after a couple of days, I decided to publish it. It went viral. I think millions of people saw it. I told him I don't want to talk to him again. A couple of days later, a very good Palestinian friend of mine, someone that I was talking to upstairs, who's from Jerusalem, said, Gershon, you made a mistake. He said, if your communication with Razi Hamad could save lives, you shouldn't cut contact with him. About 3 weeks later, I wrote to him saying, Razi, if being in contact can save human lives, then we should talk. He contacted me about 3 weeks later. In the interim, he never said anything to me, but I heard that 17 close members of his family were killed by Israel. And that can certainly impact a person, what they respond and say. I can't forgive him for what he said. We spent many times over this last 18 years talking about family and dreams and religion. He knows that I'm not religious at all, and he used to end a lot of our conversations by saying, I'll pray for you. So we talked about a lot of things. Since our renewed contact, there's only one thing I talked to him about. That's the hostages and ending the war.
Your political and pacifist activism began when you were still a teenager back in the US, where you were born and raised. You joined a youth Zionist movement and spent 1 year in Israel, right? Which seems to be a turning point in your life.
I was in Israel several times before that year. That was the gap year between high school and university.
Then you decided to make Aliyah. And when you finally moved to Israel, you went to a Palestinian village, right? Because you wanted to get to know them being the Arabs. Very soon you ended up being, knowing more Palestinians and more about Palestinians than most Israeli Jews. What drove you in this direction?
After the gap year that I spent in Israel, and I came back and worked at the Zionist summer camp in upstate New York, and I had time to reflect on this very intensive year that I spent in Israel, half a year on a kibbutz, half a year in Jerusalem, already knowing that when my parents forced me to come back to the States to finish my first degree at least, I wanted to stay in Israel and join the army right after that year, but they were smarter than me and made me come back to the States, and I did my degree. While I was spending that summer contemplating this new place that was going to be my home, it was really kind of esoteric story. I had a map of Israel next to my bed in the summer camp, and I had little pins of all the places that I visited. And in those days, the map of Israel was the greater land of Israel. It was the Golan Heights and the West Bank and the Sinai. It was the whole post-1967. Someone had come into my room in the camp and drew the green line on the map, the border that existed before 67. And I'm looking at this map. The kibbutz is up north and Jerusalem is down here. And I used to travel through the Jordan Valley between the kibbutz and Jerusalem. And suddenly it dawned on me that I spent the whole year in Israel in this intensive Zionist educational program, and I didn't have a single conversation with an Arab. I went to the old city, I traveled around, but on the kibbutz where we lived, they told us there was an Arab village 2 kilometers away. They told us, don't go there, it's dangerous. And they told us, when you go to the old city of Jerusalem, don't change money with the Arab money changers because the money goes to buy weapons for the PLO. So they told us all this kind of stories. And I realized that I was moving to a country where 40% of the population living in the territories of that country were Palestinian Arabs, and I knew nothing about them. So I decided I had to learn about them. I had to read. I had to start talking to Palestinians on campus. And in 1975, I wrote an article, my first article that was published, calling for the establishment of a Palestinian state next to Israel. It was published in a Jewish newspaper out of California. I came to the conclusion because Israel describes itself as a Jewish country, the nation state of the Jewish people, and a democratic country. And in a reality where at that point there were 40% Palestinians, today there are 50% Palestinians, there are 7 million Palestinian Arabs and 7 million Israeli Jews living between the river and the sea, the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And Israel controls all the territory. Even if it left Gaza, and even if there's a Palestinian Authority, Israel controls it all. So Israel is lying to itself. We cannot be democratic when half the people living under our control don't have democracy, and we can't be Jewish when half the people living under our control are not Jewish. So it seemed to me that the ultimate Zionist fulfillment of the idea of a Jewish democratic state was having the Palestinians have their own state next to Israel. It just made sense. But what I found immediately was that all my Israeli friends were attacking me and saying, you're a naive, stupid American. And they said that sentence all the time, you don't know them. Now, I was too ignorant to be able to even think to ask them how you know them. Of course, they didn't. And I decided that when I did make Aliyah, I'm a political person. I want to be involved. I want to have credibility. So I looked for a way to gain credibility. It just fell on me that there was a Reform rabbi who was creating a new project to bring American university Jewish graduates to live in Arab villages in Israel, Israeli citizens of Israel, and work on building programs of coexistence with nearby Jewish communities. They had an office right up the road from New York University where I was studying, went into the office, the next day signed up, spent half a year on a kibbutz in a training program, and then spent 2 years as a volunteer community worker living in an Arab village of 8,000 people, visited more than 500 homes in the 2 years that I lived there. And after 3 months, I found that I knew more about them than 99% of the Israelis.
You know the West Bank pretty well, much better than most Israelis. You certainly know the villages, individual people, entire families. How does it feel to see the current situation of growing violence, more and more illegal settlements, and what many already call Jewish terrorism?
First of all, since October 7th, I have not visited the Palestinian areas of the West Bank for my own personal safety. There's too much anger, there's too much trauma, it's too dangerous. And even though I'm probably the only Israeli who has insurance for my car from an Israeli insurance company to travel in the Palestinian areas, I have not done that since October 7th. And it's really missing for me because I would spend 1 or 2 days a week meeting with Palestinians in the West Bank, in towns, cities, villages, refugee camps. What's going on in the West Bank, most people don't know. There have been, I think the number is above 600 now, of Palestinians who have been killed by Israelis, the army, and settlers since October 7th. This is the untold story. 20 Palestinian communities in the West Bank have been evacuated by Jewish settler violence. 20 communities picked up and ran away because their houses were being burned, their cars were being burned, people were being shot at. They left. 36 new settlements have been built by this Israeli government since October 7th. The biggest drive of settlement building in the last 56 years. This is a disaster. This is writing our own death wish. This is suicide for the state of Israel. And it's going under the watchful eye of Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. You know, people don't realize this, but Israel has been able to claim that it governs the West Bank, the occupied territories, under the Fourth Geneva Conventions, because the legal sovereign, according to Israel, until this government 2 years ago, was the Israeli army. Laws were signed into into being official by the commander of the IDF forces in Judea and Samaria, not by the Israeli government. And that meant that settlers were also officially under military law. But when Netanyahu made this government 2 years ago, he appointed Bezalel Smotrich, our Minister of Finance, as a minister in the Ministry of Defense, and in charge of the civil administration, which is the army body which governs the Palestinians and the settlers. And by doing that, Netanyahu put Israel in contravention of the Fourth Geneva Convention, meaning that the Security Council and the International Court of Justice in The Hague could rule that Israel is in violation of international law, that the occupation is illegal, and that settlements are illegal. And this is all international law today, and this is the actions of Israel. While there was a military government, we could claim that the situation is temporary. Of course, the High Court of Justice in The Hague ruled this past year that it's no longer temporary, it's permanent, and it's illegal.
According to a New York Times podcast, and the title is Israel's Existential Threat from Within, published just last week, there was this letter by the head of the Shin Bet to Netanyahu saying that the settlers' violence is a great stain on Judaism and that it will cause, quote, global delegitimization, even among our best friends, posing a, quote, security threat for all of Israel. And according to him, to the reporter, the Israeli project is in jeopardy. Do you think so too?
100%. The biggest existential threat to the state of Israel is the failure to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The settlements have been related to by the United States as an obstacle to peace. It's much more than an obstacle to peace. It is the derailing of any chance of arriving at a two-state solution. If there is not going to be a credible Palestinian state, then the only answer for the Palestinians are groups like Hamas. The only way to defeat Hamas and radical ideologies is to let the Palestinians know in real time that they will have freedom, liberation, independence, and dignity. And without that, there is no reason for young people in Palestine to be peaceful. There's no reason. They have no future. We see a failing economy now since October 7th. There were 200,000 Palestinians that were earning their living inside of Israel before October 7th. They haven't been able to put food on their table. We're talking about the impact of more than close to 2 million people who have no money, they have no jobs, they have no work, they have no food for their children. What are their children going to do? We have the government of Israel, which is withholding taxes from the Palestinians because Palestine has no external borders. Israel collects customs on behalf of the Palestinian Authority by agreement, and we do accounting of VAT taxes, and that money accounts for 50% of the Palestinian budget. The Palestinian national budget is $13 billion in debt. The Palestinian banks won't loan them any money anymore. Government workers in the Palestinian Authority are not being paid. They're told by the ministers not to come to work. They're getting 50% of their salary. This is a death wish by any logical, rational person, understanding that with the settler violence, the increased settlement building, the lack of economy in the West Bank, this is an explosion waiting to happen. It's already happened. We see an increase in terrorist attacks against Israelis, settlers against Israeli soldiers, and it will get worse. And this was the warning letter of the head of the Shin Bet to the government of Israel, saying what you're doing, the policies that you are implementing are disastrous for the security of Israel.
I do have a couple more questions, but before I go on, pessoal, se vocês quiserem fazer perguntas, a Caroline está ali e ela aceita por escrito. Ela tem papeizinhos aí para distribuir, então vocês levantem a mão que ela vai circulando por vocês e aí vai passar as perguntas para mim. In São Paulo last week, you shared your vision about the importance of education for peace, which should include teaching Hebrew to Palestinian children and Arabic to Jewish kids. But this is a double political decision. And to take that decision, we need perhaps new leaders.
Yeah, we're going to have new leaders. Abbas is going to go. Hamas is not going to be there. Netanyahu is going to go. I can't point to you who these leaders are going to be, but we should remember that before the war, there were 40 weeks of demonstrations in Israel to save our liberal democracy. Sorry, and it was run by civil society. It was run by people that we didn't know, who rose from the public in the moment of need and led 40 weeks of demonstrations. And in the last 8 months, actually from October 8th, when our government failed to protect us on October 7th and failed to function on October 8th, and since October 8th, civil society took over. Organizations rose and provided services for the people. They're doing it too today because our government is dysfunctional. You know that President Biden has spent more time with the families of hostages than any minister in the Israeli government. President Biden has more time for them than the ministers of the Israeli government. Netanyahu doesn't attend funerals when soldiers are killed or when hostages have been killed. He doesn't show up. This is a disaster. But we have new leaders who are out there who will rise to the moment, will rise to the occasion. We will see a realignment of the Israeli political scene. It is true that Israel has moved to the right. There's no question about it. But we have to recognize that we're living in trauma. In Israel, we don't talk about this being December, what's the date today? December 23rd. It's October 353. We're still living October 7th. And the people of Israel, you know, as Jews here, this was the biggest trauma for the Jewish people in the state of Israel since the Holocaust. More Jews were killed in one place than at any time since the Holocaust. I'll remind you that our Palestinian neighbors are suffering the biggest trauma in 75 years. They are reliving the Nakba. And not only Palestinians in Palestine and in Gaza, but every Palestinian everywhere in the world is reliving the trauma of 1948, part of our collective memories. So we are not rational and coherent today, and we cannot think clearly. But something's really interesting happening in the Israeli public mind, and this is being documented in research being done by a very good and new research center at the Hebrew University called Accord, which is a social psychology research center. They're doing in-depth public opinion research every month now since the beginning of the war. And what they found is while the public politically is voicing right-wing opinions, an overwhelming majority of Israelis are now saying that there is no military solution to the conflict. This shows a much more complex picture of Israeli public opinion. They don't yet believe that there's a Palestinian partner willing to make peace. For years, since the Second Intifada, since the year 2000, I have heard over and over again by thousands of Israelis and Palestinians, they would both say the same thing to me. They would say, we want peace, but they don't. And the truth of the matter is, when you look at the objective reality, Israelis and Palestinians have no reason to believe that the other side wants peace. That has to change, and that's where I come to education. Education during the Oslo peace process was an afterthought. It was added to the agreement after the agreement was made. And because they needed to find a role for the Norwegians, it was Oslo. So they created a people-to-people project in the Oslo peace process. But no one thought that this peace process can't just be between leaders shaking hands and signing a piece of paper. We need to make it something real for people. And I've always said, if you want to understand a society, any society, look at what they teach their children. That reflects the real values of the society. And when we look at what we teach our children in Israel and in Palestine, we don't teach them peace. We don't teach them that there's an option of peace. We don't teach them anything about the other side except bad things. Now, we've done bad things to each other. We're not going to erase that. Our narrative is not going to be revolutionarily changed and made all pink and good. We've done bad things. That's part of our history. But we have to give our young people the understanding that there is another people here, that everyone living between the river and the sea has the same right to the same rights. That's the basis on which everything has to be built. And then we need to agree that we accept criteria for evaluating our educational systems. There are criteria available. There's UNESCO has criteria on peace education. There's the International Institute for Peace Education, which produce criteria. And then each side has to go back and evaluate itself. It will never be accepted that we'll evaluate the other side, But we need to look at ourselves based on agreed upon criteria, and we need to make a commitment, for example, something very simple, so logical. Every Israeli Jew should learn Arabic from the first grade at the same level that they learn English. And every Palestinian Arab should learn Hebrew from the first grade at the same level that they learn English. There is no way that we can build a peaceful two-state solution if we don't talk each other's languages, if we don't understand each other's cultures, if we don't think about a future which is linked. We are linked to each other. Walls and fences will not build peace between us. It's the cross-boundary cooperation that will.
What do you make of a movement such as Standing Together?
Standing Together is an important movement of young people mostly. They are maturing and growing rapidly. I'm happy to be a contributor on a monthly basis to this organization. They're mostly self-funded by Israelis. It's a Jewish-Arab movement, 50-50, with a joint board. It's an activist movement. I want to see them mature into a political body. Now, I was part of 2 years ago forming a new political party in Israel called All of Its Citizens, which is a party which is 50% Jews, 50% Arabs, 50% men, 50% women in all of our institutions. We probably will not be successful unless we join with groups like Standing Together. Another important movement I want to mention is Women Wage Peace. Women Wage Peace is the largest peace movement in Israel. They have more than 50,000 members. And they established a sister movement in Palestine called Nisa il-Shams, Women of the Sun. And they are working together across boundary. I've talked to the leadership of Women Wage Peace just last month about trying to create a movement of mothers in the region, not only in Israel and Palestine, but in Jordan and Egypt, in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in all the countries of the region, a women's movement called a movement of mothers who want these wars to stop and want us to build a better future for us all. Power to the women. This can make all the difference that we need. And these are two classic organizations that are very important. One of the founders of Women Wage Peace, Vivian Silver, is a very good friend of mine. She was killed on October 7th in Kibbutz Be'eri. She was a peace activist. She had friends in Gaza. She was one of the volunteers in a movement like I do, taking Palestinian sick kids. She drove kids from Gaza to hospitals in Tel Aviv. I drive kids from the West Bank to hospitals in Jerusalem, dialysis kids who have to get to the hospital 3 times a week. Vivian was a real activist. She was an activist for women's rights and civil rights and Palestinian-Israeli peace. And her children, her 2 sons, are now carrying the torch of what she believed in and have turned into a real super terrific activist.
So some questions are arriving from the audience. There is a question concerning the possibility of a new Palestinian government. How can it happen if Iran supports Hamas? So it's about the role of Iran.
Let's debunk some myths about Iran. First of all, do you know that 90% of the Muslims in the world are Sunnis and only 10% are Shiites? Iran, Hezbollah are Shiites. They only represent 10% of the Muslims in the world. There are no Palestinian Shiites. Palestinians are all Sunnis. Anyone who knows anything about the inter-Muslim politics and history know that Shiites and Sunnis don't get together. Sunnis believe that Shiites are heretics, that they're not real Muslims. Hamas broke off from Iran in 2012 at the time of the Arab uprising, the Arab Spring. They left Damascus, they left Tehran, they didn't have support. Tehran has supported the Islamic Jihad, which is a much smaller group, not Hamas. Out of desperation over last years, there's been struggles within Hamas of whether or not to renew relations with Iran. Some of the more extreme members of Hamas did go along that line. But Iran is not the main supporter of Hamas. It is the main supporter of Hezbollah. It is the main supporter of the Houthis in Yemen. It is the main supporter of the Shiite guards in Iraq. But most of Hamas's support did not come from them. They came from Al-Qaeda, they came from ISIS, they came from Muslim fundamentalists around the world. They came from money that Netanyahu asked the Qataris to provide for Hamas. That was billions came from Qatar with the permission of Netanyahu. An emissary from Qatar, a man named Mohammed Ali Mahdi, would arrive at Ben Gurion Airport with suitcases full of dollars that he would go to Gaza and bring with the permission of Israel. So this Hamas-Iran thing is a big myth. Iran is a problem, is a very big problem for the security of the world. Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, is very old. He's not going to be there forever. After the helicopter crash that killed the prime minister, they held elections there. Now, these are not free elections. Only certain selected people are allowed to run. But it turned out that the person who won prime minister, take into account that a majority of Iranians didn't even vote. They boycotted the elections. But nonetheless, the person who was considered the reformist won the election. And there's a great deal of credibility to believe that the restraint of Iran after the presumed assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran by Israel is the result of the pressure of the new prime minister in Iran. The Iranian people don't want the Ayatollahs to rule them anymore. They're against that regime. In 2009, the Green Revolution almost succeeded. If they hadn't been abandoned by the United States and the West, they might have succeeded. It's a brutal regime that's supported by the Revolutionary Guard, who have no red lines. But eventually this regime will fall. The question is, how bad will it get until then, and will Iran decide to have a bomb? This is another thing. Iran is a very sophisticated country. It's very technologically advanced. It's a very smart country. How is it that they've had a nuclear program for 35 years and they don't have a bomb, when Pakistan got a bomb, India got a bomb, North Korea got a bomb? My understanding is that they have not made the decision to have a bomb yet. If they will make the decision, they'll have it overnight. They'll have it very quickly. But so far, they have not decided to have it. To the best that we know, once they have a bomb, it's a very different reality, a global reality. And it is the responsibility of the international community to deal with it, not Israel's responsibility. Israel has no military option vis-a-vis Iran, despite Netanyahu's psychotic, narcissistic envisions of attacking Iran.
And ironically, there is the deterrence factor, and then Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates can support the project of, the two-state solution.
Right, and the Saudis are probably going to get from the Americans a nuclear reactor for nuclear energy because they want to wean themselves from oil. Too bad they're not going for more renewables and not nuclear energy, but that's what they want. The Saudis is the cherry on the cake for Israel. Saudi is the most important country economically in the region, while Egypt is the strongest and most important country right now in terms of Israel in the region. It's Saudi Arabia that's very important. And the fact that Mohammed bin Salman, the person who actually rules the country, has said that there will be no progress on normalization with Israel without a Palestinian state. This is really important, and this will become more important when the war ends and Israelis begin to think more logically and rationally again.
Another question here. What do you think about this Palestinian trauma? What's the prospect for kids who see their relatives being killed? What's the option other than being radicalized?
The option, the alternative to being radicalized is being de-radicalized with the understanding that they're going to achieve freedom and independence and dignity. We are going to have to develop a process that was similar to what happened in South Africa of truth and reconciliation. We are going to have to make it culturally appropriate to Judaism and to Islam. The Muslims have something they call sulha. It's a kind of ceremony where you do voice remorse and there's a payment of some kind or another. We're going to have to develop something which is organic and local, and it's going to require courageous people in Israel and in Palestine to stand up and say, I'm sorry. What we did was done in our names, and I am voicing remorse. It should never happen again. One of my close Palestinian friends, the person I was speaking to before, Samer Sinjalawi, who's a Palestinian from Jerusalem, he's part of the opposition to Mahmoud Abbas within Fatah. several weeks after October 7th, went down to Kibbutz Kfar Aza, and he stood there and he was filmed in a documentary film in which he said, I came to Kfar Aza, this kibbutz that was decimated. People were killed and people were taken hostage. And he said, this was done in my name. I'm a Palestinian, and I didn't approve it. No one asked me. I'm against it. He said to me, this man, my good friend Samer, one day, the first or second week of the war, we were sitting in his living room in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, and he said to me, as we were watching children being killed in Gaza, he said to me, Gershon, if to have a Palestinian state, we have to kill Israeli children, I don't want it. Just think about what a remarkable statement that is. If to have a Palestinian state, we have to kill Israeli children, I don't want that state. I have said vocally that what's being done in Gaza is being done in my name, and I'm opposed to it, and I'm against it. And I believe that the state of Israel is committing war crimes in Gaza. Just as Hamas committed war crimes in Israel, without comparing them, we cross moral red lines that we should never cross, and we have to say it's wrong, and I'm sorry, and I will do everything in my power to make sure that it never happens again. We have to voice remorse, we have to own the truth, and we have to stand up and say that we won't allow it to happen.
Do you think the hard right tries to kidnap the Zionist idea and do some of the actions taken and the crimes perpetrated in the name of Zionism mean more international isolation for Israel, more anti-Semitism, affecting also diaspora Jews?
Of course.
And more obstacles to achieving security and peace in the Middle East?
I am an Israeli citizen now for 46 years because of Zionism. Several years ago, I published in my weekly column that I can no longer call myself a Zionist because what's done in the name of Zionism is opposed to everything I believe in. So if people ask me, are you a Zionist? I say, tell me what it is, and then I'll tell you what I am. I don't know what Zionism is today. What is called Zionism today is not what I believe in. A Zionist response to Palestinian terrorism is killing Palestinians or building new settlements. That, in my mind, is not what I thought Zionism was about. On the issue of anti-Semitism, I've been speaking up for years that the Israeli government and the American Jewish establishment have committed a crime against the Jewish people by equating anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. Anti-Semitism is illegitimate at all times, in all places, forever. Criticism of Israel is legitimate. It is true that within the crowd of people who criticize Israel, there are anti-Semites, and maybe their motivation for criticizing Israel is anti-Semitism. But if we make all criticism of Israel anti-Semitic, we don't know how to differentiate between the two, and then we're all victims of it. And anti-Semitism is no doubt spreading. But a lot of what we see in the Free Palestine movement is not anti-Semitism. It's legitimate criticism of Israel. And it should be said, and it should be voiced. When I meet people who support boycotting Israel, BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction Movement, I always ask them, when does it end? What's your end game? What do you want to achieve? And then I know what kind of argument to have with them. There are people who say it will never end as long as Israel exists. So then I ask them to explain to me, what does that mean that Israel doesn't exist? Does that mean that all the Jews have to be killed or all the Jews have to be expelled? And we can have that conversation. Usually when someone tells me yes, I tell them, tell me how you're going to do it. Let's talk, tachlis. You're going to use trains and buses, airplanes, gas chambers, how are you going to do it? You have to put people in a position to own up to the words that they say. I had an argument with people about the boycott divestment movement when SodaStream moved from the West Bank and built a factory inside of Israel next to a Bedouin village, one of the poorest villages in Israel, hires most of its workers from the Bedouin community, pays them way above minimum wage, and continues to employ workers from the West Bank. I called for a boycott. Let's buy SodaStream. They did the right thing. And yet SodaStream still appears on the list of the boycott campaign. And this doesn't make sense to me. So we need to be clear about strategies and what it's all about. By the way, you've probably seen this on television, Columbia universities and other places when you have all these people protesting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They asked some of the protesters which river and which sea, and they didn't even know which river and which sea. So we have to be serious about these arguments and know who we're talking to before we get all frizzled. The other thing I want to comment is that, and I said this in Sao Paulo as well, to me it's insane to import the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to here. I always tell people, if you support Israel or you support Palestine, that's fine. Do something constructive. Importing the conflict here makes no sense. It doesn't help Israel. It doesn't help Palestine. Don't waste your time. Don't do it. Who cares? You're having a fight about Israel and Palestine here. You want to help Israel? Help Israel. You want to help Palestine? Help Palestine. There are plenty of things that you can do to help both sides without having the conflict here, which doesn't help anyone and just destroys people here. It's much better to go and talk to some pro-Palestine people and tell me, hey, why do you support Palestine? What about it do you support? Why? Let me understand. Let's talk. You don't have to argue. Ask a question and listen. It's much more effective than getting into an argument.
What's your take on the occupations of American universities? What happened there, and it's still happening actually, but it was stronger you mentioned Columbia University. So what's your view about what happened in the U.S. in the universities?
Yeah, I've lectured at a lot of American universities. I've never been protested. I have a different message. And in the last years when I do it, and even proposed it to the university in Sao Paulo that I spoke at a few days ago, that we organize a webinar with myself and my colleague Samer together. We've done this at universities all over the world. We can either physically come there or do it on Zoom. And it's a much different conversation when you have an Israeli who supports peace and a Palestinian who supports peace, who are both loyal nationals of their own people, and not marginal people, but people who really come from the center of societies to have a conversation together about the joint future that we have. And that's the way to approach it. Again, these protests are very disassembling. They're very polemic. They create a lot of anxiety and fear and violence. And it's something that should be avoided, particularly in a university setting where you're supposed to listen. I tell audiences all over, do yourself a favor and read something every couple of days that you don't agree with. We tend to read only things that we agree with. We watch the news stations that we agree with. I'm guilty of it myself. I hate to watch Fox News or watch, we have Channel 14. Channel 14 is the right-wing fake news station in Israel, and they invite me every week to appear there. It's the only station in Israel where I won't go because they're fake and they're lies and they incite to violence and hatred. So I won't go there, but every so often I make the tragic mistake of listening to them. It's really hard, but we have to do it because you have to understand what people are saying on the other side of the argument.
There is a question here about what you learned when you lived in a Palestinian village. What's the most precious, most beautiful thing you saw or you learned?
Yeah, when I was living there, I moved there when I was 23 years old, 22 years old. So I was quite young and innocent. And I learned, first of all, a wonderful trick. When you're culturally ignorant, you're allowed to make mistakes. In Arab tradition, which is an extraordinarily hospitable culture, when you walk by, people don't walk anymore, everyone rides in their cars or their whatever. But in those days when I was living there, you actually walked around the village, and when you walk by a person's house, they're sitting outside, they would say to you, "Tfaddal, come in." And it's probably out of courtesy most of the time, but because I was culturally ignorant and excused, I visited more than 500 homes during the 2 years that I was there. I accepted the invitation. By the way, before I moved to this village called Kufar Kara, I never drank coffee. But there was no way I was going to make it 2 years in an Arab village without drinking coffee. The first times I took it, I drank it like it was whiskey. Get it down my throat, but it was hot, so I couldn't do that. I'm a coffee drinker now. What I learned was, it was remarkable. When I would tell Israelis that I'm living in an Arab village, the first question they would say to me is, aren't you scared? And it seemed like a really strange question to me because the house that I lived in didn't even have a lock on the door. My house was open 24/7. And I was welcomed by everyone in the village. It was a village of 8,000 people. It wasn't like a small little, I don't know what you call it. It was a serious place. And I was welcome. Everywhere I went, I was welcome, and people wanted to invite me to their homes. I learned tricks that were important. You know, I grew up in this Jewish Ashkenazi tradition with a Jewish mother who made me eat all the food on my plate. The first Arab wedding I went to, in those days they didn't use wedding halls. They did the weddings in the courtyards of people's homes, and the women of the family would cook in these huge pots, and the whole village is invited. You could have a wedding, you never know how many people are going to show up. It's hundreds. And they have these huge tables, and you sit down, and they put a plate of food in front of you, meat and vegetables and salad and rice and hummus, and I finished the food on my plate. Before I did this, I had another plate in front of me. I learned a trick. It took me a few years to learn. I would say to people, I'm full. I had enough. No more. I learned a trick. Leave some food on the plate and say, Alhamdulillah. Praise be God. Once you praise God, you're finished.
Many questions here about the possibility of negotiating peace with terrorists.
There's no deal on the table of peace between Israel and Hamas. That's not on the table. Hamas is not talking about peace. Maybe Hamas will go through reform. Maybe they will draw some new conclusions. I'm very doubtful about that because the Hamas movement is based on a distorted theology of Islam. And it's much harder to change religion than it is to change politics. So I think the process of changing Hamas will be much longer. But let's face it, in every conflict for liberation around the world, each side calls the other terrorist. I read the accounts of Hamas on Telegram. Telegram's legal here, right? Yeah. On Telegram, the accounts of Hamas use the same exact language that the Israelis use when they talk about Hamas. Hamas calls the Israelis Nazi pigs, and the Israelis call Hamas Nazi pigs. It's the same language that's used by both sides, and we all know that one man's terrorist is another man's liberation freedom fighter, whatever you want to call it. Menachem Begin was a terrorist, Yitzhak Shamir was a terrorist, Yasser Arafat was a terrorist, and even Benjamin Netanyahu shook his hand. So this terminology is not helpful. I think it's also important to give definitions to words and use those definitions properly. In my mind, terrorism is the use of violence against civilians for political purposes, whether it's done by individuals, organizations, or states. When a Palestinian militant or guerrilla shoots an Israeli soldier, that's guerrilla warfare. It might be very bad, but it's not terrorism. If they shoot an Israeli civilian, that's terrorism. So we need to be clear about terminology as well. Maybe it's semantics and maybe it's not important, but I think that words are important. And I think that you make peace with your enemies. You don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies.
Sure.
And we've done horrible things to each other over 75 years. More, Jews and Arabs have been killing each other for more than 100 years already. Isn't it enough?
Almost 50 years ago, as you told us, you wrote that op-ed article for the Berkeley newspaper. You were called naive, right? Your life has proven your critics wrong because you were a man of action rather than naivety. But why and how do you remain an optimist?
First of all, it's my DNA. I can't help it. My mother used to joke with me and said that I created a job for life. I would never be unemployed. That's a good thing not to be unemployed. But I think just it's part of my own psychological well-being. The only way that I can function in such a horrible reality is by doing something. And my mind works overtime on trying to think out of the box, trying to think strategically. Strategic thinking is something that's really difficult. And very few people actually know how to do it because most of us get stuck in the reality that we're in and can't think about how we get beyond the reality. And I've been blessed, I guess, with the ability to think strategically. So I'm always thinking about how to go beyond the obstacles that are in front of us. The obstacles should not be there to block us. We need to overcome the obstacles. We need to move them aside. There'll always be new obstacles to overcome, but what keeps me going is doing something new all the time, in talking to more people. I live in peace. I'm not at war with the Palestinian people. I'm not at war with the Jewish people. I cross these borders all the time for 46 years that I've been living now in Israel. I have thousands of friends on both sides of the conflict. I send money to families in Gaza, people that I know who have no food to buy, who have no clothes, last night I got calls from people in Gaza to buy plastic to put over their tents that they're living in because the rain started last night in Gaza. These are people that I know, people that I've visited, people that I've been in contact with for years. So I'm not in conflict. I cannot accept the reality that we have to think about killing each other.
Gershon, thank you so much.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
Thank you.
Now I need an autograph. Can you? Oh, sorry.
You spell your name?
Shana Tova.
Okay.